Hello, and welcome to this introduction to some of the pieces that we cover on the Spirit Box Patreon. So today, this is a lecture on Djinn and Djinn hybridism throughout history, predominantly mythology across the Islamic world. We also dip into kind of where hybridism pops up in some of British and Irish folklore. This is one of four lectures. I think it's the shortest one. We also get into the entire kind of origin mythology of where the Djinn are from, what they are deemed to be. We get into the various different categories of Djinn, how they appear. We also talk about how magicians engage and indeed various different types of magical acts that incorporate or petition the Djinn for their intercession. So if that sounds like your bag, then click the Patreon link below and come and check out the other videos. Right, let's get into it. Okay, so we're picking up where we left off, and this is part 2 of the Djinn lectures. So we're looking at the idea of hybridism when we just come from having an initial discussion on the Queen of Sheba, Belquis, and the mythology around her being a part Djinn. But there are some other interesting characters who claim similar ancestry. So Sargon of Akkad, this particular quote is attributed to him. Sargon, the mighty king, king of Akkad am I, my mother was a changeling, my father I knew not. So Sargon the Great, who ruled the Akkadian Empire 4,000 years ago, is alleged to have claimed to be half Djinn. And this is kind of a thing that kings tend to do, right? They claim to be semi-divine. It's always a good way to reinstate your power and emphasize your right to rule by basically saying, I'm part God, or I'm fundamentally higher than you on the great cosmic food chain, not just by my office, but by my birth. You know, we have the French kings were called the Sun Kings. The Chinese emperors claimed to be part divine. The Dragon Kings, I remember correctly. So this is always a common thing. People always claim kind of a divine right to rule. So it's not really a surprise that Sargon would do this. What is also interesting is you have this idea of kind of wonderkins, of these wonder children who are of dubious parentage or unknown parentage. I mean, Jesus Christ is probably one of the big ones, right? I mean, I need to be a bit careful about how I describe him having dubious parentage. Well, there's no human father. Let's put it that way. But Merlin is a similar character. Merlin has no human father, so he's an immaculate conception, as it were, which some attribute to kind of fairies, some attribute to angels. The broad picture I'm painting is that there seems to be kind of a constant mythology of these part human wonder beings, and culturally there's an idea of this is useful for me to assert my authority to rule, but also, is there something else going on there? So I kind of wanted to look at the idea of changelings first. He uses this phrase has the term changeling in it. So changelings, I'm sure you'll be aware of the idea of, it's the theme of the swap child. Common in medieval literature, right up into, I'd say, the late 19th century, early 20th century in Ireland. Changelings were believed to be a thing. I mean, belief in changelings in Ireland. I mean, the most famous case is in 1895 when Bridget Cleary was murdered by her husband, who believed it to be a changeling, and that Bridget had been taken by the fairies. Not only that, it was Bridget's father who helped hold Bridget down while she was murdered, in the belief that it would return the real Bridget to them. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Simple charms such as inverted coats or open iron scissors left dangling over the crib where the child sleeps, things like that were employed. Iron seems to be a universal thing to repel spirits or entities of this kind, be it the Djinn, be it the Yakshinis, iron always seems to be a repellent material, which is interesting. We'll get into that later, or probably in part 3 of this series. Now, Djinn hybridism. When we kind of step past the idea of the right to rule, the idea of changelings being a method of explaining children afflicted with unexplained diseases, disorders, developmental disabilities, which kind of Lilith is the embodiment of, right? Lilith is the embodiment of human fear for their children in the face of nature. And I think if we look at it, try and look at it in a way of not how a modern looks at it. Look at it in terms of 200 years ago, where you had high child mortality rates. Life was extremely challenging, and if you made it, you'd done well. There was a very high child mortality rate, and that's a terrible fear. It's a terrible fear for any parent. But it's just the face of nature. It's the true face of nature. Life feeds on life. There is an absolute brutality that we tend to gloss over, but it's real. And I think a lot of kind of witchcraft recognizes that the face of nature is a beautiful one, but it also has fangs. Anyway, move on from that. So, Djinn hybridism, and by extension, fairy hybridism, is not quite the leap that you think. There's a lot of stuff there in the folklore, huge amount in the folklore, and we'll talk about the Irish stuff at a later date. We'll do a separate piece on that. But Djinn hybridism is an idea that's supported in some of the hadiths. So in the book Hidden Intercourse, Eros and Sexuality in the History of Western Esotericism by Jeffrey Kripal, there's a quote attributed to Lat al-Marjan, I believe. And among you are those who are expatriated, the Mukharrabin. And this, he explained, it means crossed with Djinn. So some of you out there are crossed with Djinn. Now, as I said, the same idea exists within Irish and British lore. Given the amount of amorous nature of very human-based relationships, it's not surprising. Folklore, and as I said, we'll get into this in more detail, but folklore in Ireland holds numerous families having fairy heritage, or silky heritage. It's a reasonably common thing. There's more names than you think have that kind of family folklore. If you look at the great Scottish witch hunts, and like say the case of Andrew O'Mann. So when he was on trial at the age of 70 for witchcraft, he confessed to having a sexual relationship with the Queen of Elfhant and having conceived numerous children with her. And this is on record as part of these trials. I'm not going to try and read out the thing because it's I'll just do a terrible Scottish accent. Getting back to the Djinn and hybridism. What does hybridism come from? Ultimately, it comes from the idea of a sexual congress between these beings and human beings. And that hybrid is a result of that congress. Now, there tends to be some rules around this. So, the idea of a human male and a Djinn female produces a kind of a more Djinn-focused child, an immaterial child, or a subtle being like a Djinn, whereas the other way will produce a more physical hybrid. That's kind of some of the lore around it. Just to discuss the scale of this, I wanted to kind of focus on a Moroccan folkloric figure called Aisha Quandisha. Now, Aisha Quandisha is a female mythological figure within the North African country of Morocco. She is kind of one of a number of folkloric characters who have quite distinct personalities. She's typically depicted as a beautiful young woman who has the legs of a hoofed animal, such as a goat or a camel, just like the Queen of Sheba. And descriptions can vary from region to region, which doesn't surprise me. It tends to be the same with these beings. There is a cultural variance based on location. Well, she's said to be the beautiful young woman who has the legs of a goat or similar creature who seduces handsome young men. Now, there's an interesting interview with American novelist and composer Paul Bowles with the Rolling Stone magazine in 1974. And in this interview, he describes some of the local lore on Aishi Kandisha. And he'd lived in Tangier since 1947, and this interview took place in 1947. So I'm going to kind of read part of it to you. It's going to be a little clunky, so bear with me. So, she is legion, she's manifold. I have a book that says about 25 years ago there were 35,000 men in Morocco married to her. Okay, 35,000. A lot of people in Bur Rashid, the psychiatric hospital, are married to her. What exactly happens if you look at her? Then you are married to her, and that's that. You begin behaving strangely. There are several well-known husbands of Aish Kandisha around Tangier. They walk along brooks and riverbeds, hoping to hear her voice. You see them wandering, a contagious psychosis. Right. And when they find Kandisha again, they make love to her right there. It doesn't matter who's there. So you can see, it seems to be an overwhelming thing. People become subsumed into these characters. Like I said, these human-Djinn interactions don't tend to work out well for the human. So, getting into Djinn appearances. So this is one of three broad major categories that I would kind of classify the shape of Djinn. You've got zoomorphic manifestation, you've got Djinn in the form of storms and shadows, and then anthropomorphic manifestation. So Djinn are assumed to be able to appear in the shape of various animals such as scorpions, cats, owls, and onagers. The dog is often related to the Djinn, the black dog in particular. However, piebald dogs are also identified with Djinn. And that association tends to be an Arabic literature thing. And interesting, you will have the idea of the black dog being associated with a demonic force or an otherworldly force, like you might have seen in fairy literature in Ireland and Britain. You got the idea of what's it called? The black black shug, this great beast of a dog roaming the British countryside. Serpents are animals associated with Djinn. Islamic traditions know many narratives concerning a serpent who is actually a genie. However, the Djinn cannot appear in the form of wolves. The wolf is thought to be the natural predator of the Djinn, who contrasts the Djinn by his noble character and disables them to vanish. Quite interesting. I find that extremely interesting because the wolf is a figure that humans are said to transform into. There is the werewolf. There's certain groups of witches who would transform into animals, and wolf is one of those forms. Don't know if that's connected. That's just a interesting hypothesis. Djinn in the form of shadows and storms. The Djinn are also related to the wind. They may appear as mists or sandstorms. So remember that from the first presentation, that the Djinn were said to be created from the heat of the Simund wind from the Gaza Plateau. So the heat of the wind, the desert wind, is what they are created from. Excuse me. Also, we get the idea of like dust devils in deserts. The idea of these like these spouts of like mini tornadoes that go across the desert. Zubair ibn al-Awwam, who was held to have had accompanied Muhammad during his lecture to the Djinn, is said to view the Djinn as shadowy ghosts with no individual structure. According to a narration, Ghazali asked Tabasi, famous for Djinn incantations, to reveal the Djinn to him. Accordingly, Tabasi showed him the Djinn, seeing them as they were like a shadow on a wall. After Ghazali requested to speak to them, Tabasi stated that for now he could not see more. So, although sandstorms are believed to be caused by Djinn, others such as Abu Yashi Zarakaria, Ibn Muhammad al-Khwazini, and Ghazali attribute them to natural causes. Otherwise, sandstorms are thought to be caused by battles between different groups of Djinn. Now, the Djinn are also said to travel in the wind, right? To travel by air. So when King Solomon dispatched them to build the city of Palmyra, they flew through the air instantaneously to do so, and were able to take this undertaking through their ability of flight and to manipulate heavy objects with ease, moving through the air. Again, correlation, we have the Shigiha, the fairy wind, fairies traveling in the wind. So that's where we get kind of a lot of those correlations. Now, anthropomorphic manifestation, the idea of a kind of the beings taking partial human form rather than zoomorphic manifestations. So the idea of the Queen of Sheba, the idea of that the burning relief of Lilith, with their bottom half being that of an owl, and Aisha Kandisha, as we discussed earlier. So a common characteristic of the Djinn is their lack of individuality, but they may gain individuality by materializing in human forms. But also their anthropomorphic shape. They stay part animal. They are not fully human. So therefore, we get a kind of a lot of illustrations of individual jinns being depicted as monstrous and anthropomorphized creatures with body parts from different animals, or humans with animal traits. So the idea is they stay part animal, but their bodies are depicted as kind of out of two or more different species. Some of them have the hands of cats, or the heads of birds, or the wings that rise from their shoulders. These kind of therianthropic figures. Now, I find this particularly interesting because this is virtually everywhere. If you look back through human history, from the walls of France's cave art, from the walls of the caves painted with our prehistoric ancestors, the same figures are depicted. Part human, part animal. The devil, angels, the Egyptian gods. Same thing happens again and again. So there's something deep within the human psyche that's trying to express itself there. Something about our reality that manifests again and again through this anthropomorphic archetype. And going back to the zoomorphic manifestations before we kind of move on, you think about the witch's familiar. What form do the witch's familiar come in? The idea of cats being a familiar again and again. And there's strange things in British folklore as well. So think about like Jed the Mongoose, and I might do something on that actually. Jed the Mongoose is a pretty bonkers story, which I'll dig out some links to. Okay, so that is it for part 2. The next thing we'll be going through are the categories of Djinn. Okay, that's it for me. Take care and talk soon.